Hi, Sycamore Trails. I will be reading chapter 4 and part of chapter 5 of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And I am Mrs. Peterson and I teach kindergarten. Chapter 4 The Uncertain Life of an African Farmer. To me, graduating primary school and being a scientist was loads better than farming, which by then was taking up a lot of my time. As much as I enjoyed my holiday break, most of it was filled by helping my father prepare the maize for harvest. In Malawi, maize is important as the water we drink. We eat maize for every meal, mostly in the form of ensima, which is a kind of doughy porridge. Ensima is made by mixing maize flour and hot water. When it becomes too thick to stir, you scoop it out and form cakes in the shapes of hamburger patties. To eat ensima, you tear off a piece and roll it into a ball in your palm. Then use it to scoop up your relish, stewed spinach, pumpkin leaves, or whatever happens to be in season. If your family is fortunate, maybe you also have some eggs, chicken, or goat meat to go along with it. My favorite meal in the world is ensima with dried fish and tomatoes. Yum! As I said, ensima is so important to our diets that whenever we go without it, we feel like a fish out of water. For instance, let's say that someone from America invites a Malawian to dinner and serves plates of juicy steak and mashed potatoes, followed by great slices of chocolate cake for dessert. If there's no ensima, the Malawian will probably go home and tell his brothers and sisters, "There was no food there, only steak and mashed potatoes. I hope I can sleep tonight." Growing a good maize crop is difficult and takes the whole year. It's not just the planting and harvesting that keep us busy, but also preparing the soil, adding fertilizer, and killing the weeds that grow around the plants. Such work required every person in the family. My sisters helped with the planting and harvesting, but mostly they assisted my mother around the house, fetching water and firewood, cooking and cleaning, and helping take care of the little ones, which meant that most of the field work fell on me. We began in July when we cleared the remnants of the previous season's harvest. We collected the old maize stalks and placed them into piles. Once they were arranged, Jeffrey and I set them on fire. The best thing about burning stalks were the grasshoppers. The insects liked to burrow in the piles, and once they saw smoke, swarmed out by the hundreds. We caught them and put them into sugar bags. "How many do you have, Mr. Jeffrey?" I'd ask, huffing through the smoky fields. "Lots," he'd say, holding up his bag. "Maybe 50. "Yeah, same here. Shall we eat?" "For sure." The only reason we caught grasshoppers was to roast them over a fire with salt, which we did with great excitement. This might sound disgusting to some people, but trust me, there's nothing more delicious than crunchy, roasted grasshoppers with enzima. Of course, Jeffrey and I weren't supposed to be hunting and eating grasshoppers while we worked, but in Malawi, we have a saying, "When you go see the lake, you also see the hippos." The hardest work in farming was making ridges. These are long dirt rows that you see in any field. On my farm, we didn't use a plow or a tractor to dig them, but a hoe, and digging them took all of my time. I'd start in the morning before school, waking up at 4 a.m., when the land was still dark and cool. My mother would be ready with a steaming bowl of fala, which is a kind of oatmeal made from maize. After eating, I'd stumble down the trail, dragging my hoe behind me. "Be careful with that hoe in the dark," my father would call out. "I don't want you cutting off your foot." "For sure." The big bright moon threw creepy shadows along the road. I walked quickly, trying not to think of the Gule Wankulu watching me from the trees, or the witch planes that flew overhead, looking for fresh recruits. One morning, while I was walking, a hyena called out from the bush, "Ooh!" and caused me to jump out of my trousers. I've never run so fast. After digging ridges, we waited for the rainy season so we could plant. The rains usually came the first week in December. My sisters and I moved in a line down the rows. One person made a gash with a hoe, while the other dropped 3 seeds and covered them with soil and a lot of good wishes. A couple of weeks later, when the seedlings pushed through the ground, we gave each a spoonful of fertilizer to help them grow strong. Buying seeds and fertilizer cost a lot of money, and because it always happened in December, sometimes it meant there wasn't much left for Christmas. We never had money to buy presents, especially because we had a lot of kids. So for us, the perfect holiday was simply enjoying a luxurious meal of chicken and rice together. If there was any money left over, perhaps we'd get a bottle of Coca-Cola from the market, along with some dandy sweets. Then, after December, all the money was gone. Worse, by the time most families' maize supply were also running low. Outside, it rained night and day. It was a time when people tightened their belts and waited for the harvest, which didn't arrive until May. That's when the maize stalks finally stretched above my father's head, and a whole green field would whisper your fortunes in the wind. Harvest was like one giant party. Everyone in the family headed into the rows and worked from sun up till sundown, singing, telling jokes, dreaming about the great meals to come. After we'd spent a week shucking the ears, the maize was placed in giant bags that went back in the storage room, giving us another year's worth of delicious food. In a good harvest, the bags rose to the ceiling and spilled into the hallway. For poor families like ours, it was like putting $1 million in the bank. But that was a normal year. In December 2000, everything went terribly wrong. Our first problem was the fertilizer. For years and years, the Malawian government made sure the price of fertilizer and seed was low enough so every family could afford a crop. But our new president, a businessman named Bakili Maluzi, didn't believe the government's job was to help farmers. So that year, the price of fertilizer was so expensive that most families, ours included, couldn't afford to buy it. That meant when the rains came and the seedlings pushed their way through the soil, we had nothing to give them. "Sorry, guys," I said as I stood in the field. "You're on your own this year." For those farmers who were able to afford fertilizer, it hardly mattered anyway, because as soon as the seedlings showed their tiny faces, the country began to flood. Heavy rains fell for days and days, washing away houses and livestock, along with the fertilizer and many of the seedlings themselves. Our district survived without much damage, except that after the rains finally stopped, they never came back. Malawi entered a drought. With no rain, the sun rose angry in the sky each morning and showed no mercy on the seedlings that had survived. By February, the stalks were wilted and bent toward the ground. By May, half our crop was scorched. The plants that remained were only as high as my father's chest. If you took one of the leaves in your hand, it would crumble to dust. One afternoon, my father and I stood in the field and studied this destruction. "What will happen to us next year, Papa?" I asked. He let out a sigh. "Oh, I don't know, son. But at least we're not alone. It's happening to everyone." There was no celebration that harvest. We managed to fill only 5 bags of maize, which occupied only a corner of the storage room. One night before bed, I saw a kerosene lamp flickering in the hallway and found my father standing in the open door. He was staring at those bags, but not like a man counting his riches. He seemed to be asking them a question. Whatever they told him, we'd find out soon enough. Chapter 5. Malawi begins to starve. Part of the answer arrived in late September. Not long after taking our final exams, Gilbert and I went to the trading center to play a few games of bowel. As we walked back to his house, I noticed something odd. About a dozen people were gathered in his yard, talking in low, worried voices. They were mostly women, each wearing brightly colored headscarves like my own mother, and carrying an empty basket. Who are these people? I asked. They've run out of food in the far villages, Gilbert said. These women have come to ask my father for handouts or ganyu. Some of them walked for days. Ganyu was another word for day labor, or a small job such as clearing fields or digging ridges for a little money or food. It's how many farmers in Malawi made a living when times were hard. But I'd never seen this many people at once. What's your father going to do? I said. He's going to feed them, Gilbert answered. He has no choice. He's their chief. What Gilbert said was true. The drought had destroyed all the crops in the countryside, and the families in smaller villages had run out of food. Their storage rooms were empty, and now they were hungry. I came home and told my father what I'd just witnessed. He'd also seen the lines of women, but didn't seem too concerned. He explained that the government always kept giant stocks of maize for emergencies. In tough times like these, they sold it on the market for a reduced price so that everyone could afford to eat. Don't worry, he said. Whatever the case may be, our family has never gone hungry. A few days later, however, my father returned from the trading center, where a group of farmers had held a rally. They delivered some terrible news. A few dishonest men in the government had sold our emergency maize and taken off with the money. They're saying there's nothing left, he told my mother. This year will be a disaster. Sorry, my dog Petey's barking downstairs. My mother's face seemed stricken. Only God can help us, she whispered. After that, hunger came to Malawi. Due to the shortage of maize, the price doubled in the market. When this happened, people started hunting for food in the forest. One evening before dinner, I was feeling a bit hungry, so I walked next door to see if I could snatch a few mangoes from Mr. Moale's trees. When I arrived, he and his family were sitting down to steaming plates of food. Oh, just in time, I said. But when I looked closer, I realized what the Moales were eating: pumpkin leaves and stewed green mangoes. They weren't even ripe, and I'm sure they tasted awful. You'll find no food here, Mr. Moale said, wrinkling his nose as he chewed. Later, I saw several men digging ridges in Moale's fields for ganyu. They were from the outer villages, and each walked away carrying a handful of those same green mangoes. A few days later, while walking through the trading center, I saw something else I'd never seen. Women spread out plastic tarps and were selling gaga. Gaga are the clear-colored outer layers, or chaff, that are removed from the maize kernels in the mill. It's mostly garbage, left on the mill floor and tossed away. Farmers fed it to their chickens and pigs. I like to use gaga in my bird traps, but I'd never seen people eat it. Yet here it was selling in the market for 300 kwacha, a pail, 3 times what it normally cost. A group of women held metal buckets and crowded around the sellers, pushing one another to get some. Move away, I was here first. We're all hungry, sister. There are no firsts in that. When I returned an hour later, all the gaga was gone. Right then I felt a shock pass through me, as if someone had shaken me awake in the night. I started running home. Until then, I hadn't worried much about our own situation. Being 13 years old and always hungry explained some of that. Each meal, I'd stick out my plate and ask for seconds, saying, "That's right, keep it coming." Sure, I knew about the problems throughout the country, but for some reason I always assumed they were happening to someone else. Now, as I headed home, I grew more and more afraid. When I reached the house and opened the door to the storage room, I nearly fainted. Only 2 bags of grain remained. In my mind, they were already gone. I started doing the hunger math. 2 bags of maize wouldn't last 2 months. In 3 months, we'd be starving. Worse, there were still 210 days, about 7 months, until our next harvest. We hadn't even planted one seed, and once we did plant, there was no guarantee that it would rain or that we'd even have fertilizer. A few days later, my father started rounding up our goats to sell in the market. In Malawi, your animals are your most prized possessions, a farmer's only token of wealth and class. Now we were trading them for a few pails of maize. The men who ran the Kenyanya stands selling fried meat had enormous power now. The prices they offered for goats, pigs, and cows went lower each day, yet people still lined up to sell. I noticed one of the goats was Menkalala, one of my favorites. Unlike the other goats, he loved to play. He'd let me grab his horns and wrestle in the courtyard. He and Kamba had also become friends and would chase each other around the kitchen, irritating my mother. Papa, why are you selling our goats? I asked. He turned to me. A week ago the price was 500. Now it's 400. I'm sorry, William, but if we wait any longer, we'll get nothing. The goats were tied by the legs with rope and already crying. Kamba heard the commotion and came to investigate. When he saw Menkalala being led down the trail with the others, he started to bark and jump. Menkalala then turned around as if to plead for help. He knew his fate. But as much as it hurt me inside, I had to watch him go. What could I do? My family had to eat. In early November, I started waking up as usual at 4 a.m. to make my ridges. On the first morning when I walked inside to have my breakfast, my father met me in the darkness. No fala today, he said. Huh? It's time to start cutting back. We need to save our food. By this time, our supply of maize was just 1.5 bags. Breakfast was the first to go, and I wondered what would be next. But instead of complaining, I drank a big cup of water, grabbed my hoe, and went to meet Jeffrey in the fields. I told him about skipping breakfast. Can you believe it? I asked. But my cousin simply shrugged. You're just starting that today? He said. I haven't had breakfast in 2 weeks. I'm getting used to it. In the early morning, the weather was still cool, and I could dig my ridges with great energy. But by 7 a.m., my stomach had woken up and realized it was empty. It growled and rumbled and demanded to be filled. Soon the sun was high in the sky and sucking all of my strength. The only thing keeping me awake was my father marching past. Make those ridges better, he shouted. But I'm too hungry, Papa. Think about next year's harvest, son. Try your best. It was true. My ridges looked crooked, as if a slithering snake had dug them. Across the field, Jeffrey was hard at work. Mr. Jeffrey, I called out, you dig my ridges today and I'll dig yours tomorrow. Can we make this deal? I'll think about it, he said, gasping for breath. But it sounds like the same deal as yesterday. I was trying to raise my cousin's spirits. Ever since his father died, he hadn't been the same. He looked sad, and sometimes he stayed in his room for an entire day and didn't speak to anyone. He was also sickly. At a recent trip to the clinic, the doctor said he had anemia, which is caused by not having a healthy diet. I later discovered that the breakfast wasn't the only thing Jeffrey was skipping. Food was running low all around. I'm joking, I shouted, but seriously, man, you don't look good. Take a break and get some rest. I have no choice, he said, swinging his hoe. You know my deal. I also knew that Jeffrey wouldn't be returning to school the next term. Because of the drought and losing her husband, Jeffrey's mother didn't have the money to pay his school fees. And anyway, she needed Jeffrey and his brother Jeremiah to work and provide food. That day, I pretended not to know. Soon, your man Kim Kwamba will be in secondary school where he belongs, I said, wearing trousers and walking tall. He'll find us there, Jeffrey said. We older boys have plans for Kamkwamba. You can't touch him. Oh, you wait and see. Jeffrey wasn't the only one changing. Kamba was also slowing down. I'd always known that his best years were behind him, back when he lived on the estate, but now his age was starting to show, and ever since the drought he'd grown thinner. The food I was feeding him at night just wasn't enough, I guess. As he got slower, the mice in the fields outwitted him, and the other dogs beat him to the scraps in the garbage piles. Kamba no longer chased chickens around the courtyard, but stayed in the shade and slept. I was beginning to see his ribs. One night I tossed up a ball of enzema for him to eat. He lost sight of it and it landed right on his head. "Oh, what's the problem, old man?" I teased. He leaned over and sucked the food down in one gulp. Some things didn't change. December arrived with dark skies and heavy rain. All across the region, farmers did their best to plant seed for the next harvest, yet many had abandoned their fields in order to search for food. It wasn't long before their land was choked with weeds. My father managed to plant a small plot of maize, but without any fertilizer. He also found enough seed for a half acre of tobacco, which would prove a lifesaver in the months to come. What began as a drought and hunger in Malawi soon evolved into full-blown famine. That winter, it would tighten its grip until few people were left standing. Those looking for food began to cluster in the trading center and along the roads. Groups of men carrying their hoes went house to house asking for work, their clothes soaked from the rain and covered in mud. At each place, they heard the same reply: "We have nothing to give." While the men searched for Ganyu, their wives gathered at the chief's house, where Gilbert passed out bags of flour at the door. Already, hundreds of people had received food, and more were coming. They carried children who cried from empty bellies, and some women were so weak they fainted once they arrived. After Gilbert's mother nursed them back to health, they continued down the road in search of their next bite. And that's where we're stopping for today.